Part 56. Save my little male concubine and take care of his sickness. As soon as Baiming Qianyu, who had been busy all day, stepped into the main gate of the palace, a beautiful figure instantly threw herself into his arms, and said aggrievedly, "Prince, you are back, the concubine is wronged." Luzhu and Liuyan in the distance saw Mrs. Jing pounce into the arms of Baiming Qianyu, gritted their teeth angrily, and wanted to step forward to beg for mercy for Junhua, but they were stared at coldly by the two guards on the side. And they were so frightened that they didn't dare to take another step forward. "What's going on?" Baiming Qianyu looked at Mrs. Jing with a look of grievance and tears in her eyes. And her face was unclear. "Prince, you don't know, your male concubine in China yesterday was too much, and today he said that he was going to come to ask for peace. But he let the concubine wait in the courtyard all morning. He didn't say it for a long time, but he was still teaching the concubine in the concubine's courtyard." "Prince, how could the concubine have been so wronged?" Mrs. Jing choked back tears, aggrieved and complained. And people who didn't know thought that Junhua had bullied her when they saw this scene. Luzhu and Liuyan in the distance saw Mrs. Jing was beating upside down, gritting their teeth in anger, and wanted to step forward to theorize for Junhua, but they were blocked by the two guards, glaring at them with vicious eyes. The two little girls had never seen this meeting, and they were so frightened that they could only watch Baiming Qianyu touch Mrs. Jing's head, and then walk to another path with Mrs. Jing. When the two figures walked away, Shui Hudi appeared. She looked at Luzhu, Liuyan, and warned coldly, "You two had better be obedient. If you dare to talk nonsense, I don't dare to guarantee that you two can keep all the corpses." Luzhu and Liuyan were so frightened by the Shui Hudi that they trembled. And they knew at this moment that the people in the palace were not people who ate people and didn't spit out bones. The two finally went to the outside of the ancestral hall dejectedly, praying that the two guards outside would let them in and let them see if the Junhua inside was okay. Without Mrs. Jing's order, no one is allowed to enter the ancestral hall without permission. The two guards knew that Mrs. Jing was deeply favored by the prince, so they would rather offend the newly entered Junhua than dare to offend Mrs. Jing. "Two brothers, please, let's go in and take a look, just one look," Luzhu pleaded, and she took out a few taels of silver from her body and stuffed them into the arms of the two guards. Unmoved, the two guards took the money out of their bosoms and threw it mercilessly on the ground. In the end, Luzhu and Liuyan didn't see Junhua, so they returned to Junhua's courtyard with tears. "Wu, have we done something wrong and caused an innocent person to suffer?" Liuyan cried bitterly, now regretting the decision she had made. In order to save their lives, they harmed an innocent person and suffered a crime. Now that I think about it, I suddenly realize that they have sinned heinously. Luzhu sobbed and didn't speak. She also regretted it. But now that everything has happened, regret won't help. "Why don't you light the lights?" The voice of Baiming Qianyu suddenly came, which frightened the two girls all over. And after reacting that it was Baiming Qianyu, a trace of joy flashed on their faces, and they hurriedly knelt on the ground to welcome the arrival of Baiming Qianyu. The slave and maid visit the prince. The prince is 1,000 years old and 1,000 years old. Get up and light the lights in the courtyard. Baiming Qianyu bypassed the second girl and was about to walk to the room. But who knew that Luzhu sobbed and cried, "Prince, save the young master of the slave family." Baiming Qianyu paused suddenly, a wave of uneasiness welled up in his heart. He looked back at the second girl kneeling on the ground, and asked coldly, "What do you mean?" Luzhu raised her head and sobbed and replied, "My young master got up late this morning." "But you also know why my young master got up late," but Sister Shui was not happy, and took my young master around the house for most of the hour, and when she arrived at Mrs. Jing's courtyard, it was already 3 poles in the day, but Mrs. Jing thought that my young master was deliberately late, so she punished my young master to stand in the courtyard for an hour. The slave maid saw that the young master was uncomfortable, so she kindly stepped forward and reasoned a few sentences. Who knew that the slave maid accidentally annoyed Mrs. Jing and caused my young master to be punished for kneeling in the ancestral hall. The more Luju spoke, the more sad she became, and her tears fell down, which was extremely pitiful. And my young master hasn't eaten since yesterday, and he hasn't eaten for another day today, and I don't know if my young master's body can stand it. Liuyan also added with a sob. Baiming Qianyu's expression was gloomy, and now he didn't know the truth. He didn't comment, but thinking that Junhua had been kneeling in the ancestral hall for almost a day, his heart was slightly uncomfortable. Suddenly thought that Junhua was shouting that he was hungry last night. He thought it was Junhua who had a temper and didn't care about him. Who knew that he hadn't eaten for a day yesterday, and thinking that Junhua hadn't eaten for a day today, he hurriedly strode towards the ancestral hall in distress. Baiming Qianyu pushed open the door of the ancestral hall, only to see that it was dark inside, and he couldn't see where Junhua was. Leng Yi hurriedly walked in with a lantern to light up the ancestral hall. Baiming Qianyu hurriedly looked for Junhua's figure, and when he saw Junhua curled up and sleeping on the futon, his heart seemed to be pricked by a needle, and there was a slight tingling sensation. He stepped forward and squatted in front of Junhua, and shouted warmly, "Zicheng, get up!" How could Junhua, who had fallen asleep, hear his call? Baiming Qianyu called lightly twice, and saw that Junhua looked pained, breathed heavily, his cold face was flushed, and a thin layer of sweat secreted from his forehead. He stroked Junhua's forehead with his hand. It was amazingly hot, and he hurriedly picked up Junhua and walked outside the ancestral hall. Luju and Liuyan, who were waiting outside the ancestral hall, saw that Junhua was hugged out by Baiming Qianyu, and the two hurriedly stepped forward, seeing that Junhua was unconscious. The second girl was overwhelmed by guilt in her heart, and she was stunned in place and at a loss. Leng Yi, go to the palace to ask for a royal doctor. Baiming Qianyu calmly commanded. Leng Yi answered, handed the lantern in his hand to the guard behind him, and ran towards the stables of the palace. Baiming Qianyu returned to his Jing Yashuen with Junhua in his arms. And after ordering someone to send a bucket of warm water to wash away the cold on his body, he carefully put on his underwear, and then put the person into the warm quilt. Junhua was still with a high fever, shouting that he was hungry in a daze, and when he heard it, Baiming Qianyu's heart was nervous. And he hurriedly asked Luju to go to the kitchen to serve some porridge. At this time, the Leng Yi that went to the palace to ask the imperial doctor also returned. And he pulled the panting imperial doctor into the room. Prince, Imperial Dr. Kwang is here. Leng Yi stepped forward and said respectfully. Imperial Dr. Kwang was in his 50s. And his long beard had formed a little ice slag in the icy weather. Obviously, the weather is very cold now, but Imperial Dr. Kwang, who trotted all the way, was covered in fine sweat. And he was about to kneel down to salute while panting, but was interrupted by a wave of his hand from Baiming Qianyu. All right, let's come and see the patient. Baiming Qianyu sat on the edge of the bed, looking impatient. Imperial Dr. Kwang hurriedly stepped forward to take Junhua's pulse. After he diagnosed Junhua's illness, he knelt on the ground and said, "Back to the prince. Young Master Shen is just cold into the body, causing wind and cold. And it will be fine if this small official prescribes a few pills and takes it." Baiming Qianyu bowed his head and asked him to prescribe medicine. Imperial Dr. Kwong hurriedly withdrew from the inner room, came to the outer room, and dispensed a pair of wind and cold medicine from his medicine box and handed it to Liuyan on the side. Liuyan hurriedly took the medicine and ran to the kitchen. At this time, Luju also came back with a bowl of porridge. She entered the inner room, and was just about to kneel. Baiming Qianyu said impatiently, "Don't kneel, bring the porridge and feed it to your young master." Luju stepped forward with the bowl, and Baiming Qianyu cooperated to help Junhua up, so that Luju could better feed Junhua to drink porridge. Luju looked at Junhua, who was flushed and tired. Tears blurred her eyes instantly. She bit her lower lip to hold back the tears in her eyes, and fed Junhua porridge with trembling hands. Junhua was really hungry, but he was still in a coma, but he still ate very urgently. And the porridge slid through the esophagus and into the stomach, making his stomach that had been cramping for a long time finally better than a loss. I don't know if he ate too quickly. The porridge choked into his throat, and he coughed violently, and the violent coughing sound seemed to cough out his lungs, which not only frightened the Luju who fed the porridge, but also scared the Baiming Qianyu who was holding him. Baiming Qianyu hurriedly patted him on the back, but looking at Junhua, whose face turned pale instantly, his heart throbbed. He looked at Luju who was feeding the porridge and couldn't help but be angry. "Why are you so stupid? Can't even feed porridge?" Luju was so frightened that she fell to her knees and hurriedly admitted her mistake. "The slave should die, the slave should die." Junhua was so noisy that he had a splitting headache. He struggled to open his eyes, looked at Luju on the ground who apologized again and again, and used all his strength to say, "It's so noisy." He thought that his voice was very loud, but the reality was pitiful. Only the Baiming Qianyu who was holding him heard it, and the Baiming Qianyu, who was distressed by him, shouted in a low voice to Luju, "Put down the porridge and get out." Luju was so frightened that she hurriedly stood up, put down the porridge and bent down to exit the room. When she left, there was only Baiming Qianyu and the half-awake Junhua left in the room. Junhua glanced at Baiming Qianyu beside him, and his mind was confused. He thought that Baiming Qianyu was a subordinate, and ordered, "I'm hungry, bring me a bowl of porridge." Baiming Qianyu, who was called by his subordinates, was not angry. He leaned forward, lifted the porridge that Luju put aside, and was just about to feed Junhua with a soup spoon. Who knew that Junhua was really hungry. He hurriedly put his mouth to the edge of the bowl, and drank several mouthfuls of porridge. Baiming Qianyu saw that he was drinking in a hurry, afraid that he would choke, so he put the bowl flat, which made Junhua, who had not drunk the porridge, a little dissatisfied. He raised his hand, tilted the bowl to himself, and took several sips. He didn't drink 10 mouthfuls of porridge. He finished it, and he looked at Baiming Qianyu when he was not full, and ordered, "Bring 2 more bowls of porridge." Baiming Qianyu, who was called, was quite speechless, but seeing that his spirit was much better, he was in a much better mood, and hurriedly called Luju and asked her to serve a bowl of porridge. Seeing that Junhua had regained some of his senses, Luju responded happily, and hurriedly turned around and ran towards the kitchen. In Tingshui courtyard, Mrs. Jing learned that Junhua actually lived in Jing Yashuen, and her beautiful little face was full of anger, and she looked particularly hideous in the flickering candlelight. "Madam, how can Shen Li live in the Prince's Jing Yashuen? Shui Huti is not a big deal at all," fanning the flames on the sidelines. A trace of fierceness flashed in Mrs. Jing's eyes, and her tone was resentful. "Since this Shen Li is so uninteresting, don't blame Mrs. Jing for killing him." She looked at Shui Huti and said cruelly, "Isn't he sick? Take advantage of his illness to kill him now." There is no way she can let someone who threatens her position live. Shui Huidi bowed, turned around and went out the door, and walked to the kitchen. After drinking 2 bowls of porridge, Junhua's spirit was obviously much better. And only then did he see clearly who the person who had been supporting him was, recalling what happened last night, and he was embarrassed to find a crack in the ground to get into. Looking around with both eyes, seeing that this was not the room he slept in last night, he somewhat guessed whose room it was. He glanced at Luju, who was silently hanging his head, and said to Baiming Qianyu, "Prince, it's late at night, I'll go back first. Luju, help me." Luju raised her head and looked at Junhua with a stunned face. She didn't expect Junhua to go back at this time. Seeing that Baiming Qianyu's expression was gloomy and terrifying, she couldn't wait to slap herself. Why was she in this room? "Do you have the strength to go back?" The voice of Baiming Qianyu came in a gloomy voice. This prince is just cold, and he has not exaggerated to the point that he is terminally ill and can't get up. He saw Luju stunned in place, and secretly sighed that he was never his subordinate, and he didn't understand his temperament, so he got out of bed, put on his shoes and was about to get up. At this time, Liuyan walked in with the boiled medicine, saw Junhua wearing shoes, a little confused, and was about to ask Luju with her eyes, but Junhua, who had just stood up, stumbled and pounced on her, and she hurriedly threw away the medicine bowl in her hand and went to help Junhua. Baiming Qianyu moved much faster than her, hurriedly stood up and held the crumbling body, and was just about to reprimand Junhua, when the medicine bowl fell to the ground and made a loud noise, instantly attracting everyone's attention. The few people in the room all looked at the white bubble of the liquid that had been spilled on the ground, and a chill rushed from the soles of their feet to the top of their heads. Junhua was stunned and watched the medicinal juice corroding the ground, and a cold breath felt in his heart. If he drank this bowl of medicine, he would not die or be crippled. He had picked up a life, looked at Liuyan and asked in a cold voice, "Why do you want to kill me?" Liuyan was so frightened that she knelt on the ground, her petite body couldn't stop trembling. And her tone was also scared like never before. "It's not a slave, it's not a slave. Young master, you have to believe in a slave. It's not a slave who wants to harm you. Even if she is given 100 guts, she will not dare to harm Junhua." Baiming Qianyu didn't believe that Liuyan would harm Junhua, after all. Liuyan was a dowry maid brought by Junhua, and there was no reason why it would harm Junhua. He looked at Junhua, who had a gloomy expression, and comforted, "Ziqing, it shouldn't be Liuyan. She has no reason to hurt you." "What's no reason? If I die, these 2 girls will be the happiest, because no one will know that I am an impostor who has been married." He is well aware of the ugliness of human nature, so he believes in no one except his guards. Thinking that all his guards were buried in Jinghe Kingdom, his heart ached. You must know that Wei Feng, Wei and others were guards who had accompanied him for more than 10 years, and they all died like this. He obviously suspected that Luju and Liuyan were going to harm him. But he couldn't say what he thought, so he had to stare at Luju and Liuyan with cold eyes. At this moment, Baiming Qianyu thought of the concubines in the backyard. His eyes were a little colder. And he shouted at Leng Yi outside the door, "Leng Yi, come in." Leng Yi came to the room like a ghost, and arched his hand. "Prince, my subordinates are here. Immediately investigate who went to the kitchen tonight." Baiming Qianyu's expression was gloomy, and he dared to poison him under his nose, and he would not spare it. Junhua was still uncomfortable. He could still support it with willpower for a while just now, but at this time he was weak, dizzy, and so uncomfortable that he wanted to vomit. However, The people next to him hugged him tightly, making him want to walk, and he couldn't sit, and he was so uncomfortable that he wanted to die on the spot. In the end, he was really uncomfortable. He simply didn't exert himself, and leaned limply on Biming Qianyu's arms. Unexpectedly, he found that the broad chest of Biming Qianyu made him feel an unprecedented sense of security. Especially the powerful arms around his waist made his heart a little sore, as if the people around him were like his mother, making him feel a different kind of warmth that he hadn't felt for a long time. Biming Qianyu naturally noticed the change in Junhua. His heart was sweet, he couldn't say what it felt. He saw Junhua's tired expression, and said gently, "Lie down and sleep for a while." This prince asked Leng Ning to boil a bowl of medicine. "Thank the prince cares, you don't need to boil medicine. It's just a cold, it'll be fine in a few days." He doesn't trust anyone now, he just wants to escape from the Wanyu palace and return to the Holy Dynasty. He looked at Luju on the side and said, "Luju, help me go back to rest." Luju looked stunned. At this juncture, how dare she step forward to help Junhua? Especially when she saw Biming Qianyu's face sank. She was so frightened that she hurriedly lowered her head, pretending not to hear. Junhua is so depressed, if only Wei An were there, at least he wouldn't ignore him. "You two go down." Biming Qianyu's voice was low, trying his best to suppress the anger churning in his chest. It can be said that it is the first time that he is so good to a concubine. But the other party just doesn't accept his affection and ignores his existence again and again. Luju Liuyan didn't dare to linger for a moment, hurriedly walked out of the room and closed the door. Junhua looked at the immoral streamers, vomiting blood angrily. These two bastards actually threw him here so ruthlessly. The air in the room was frozen, oppressive. And it was so oppressive that you wanted to escape. Especially the person next to him was full of low air pressure, which made people uncomfortably out of breath. But he was so uncomfortable that he couldn't exert any strength, and he was powerless to escape. Without outsiders, Biming Qianyu became unscrupulous. He hugged Junhua, and his hands moved restlessly. "Prince, my body. No. Suitable." Junhua was so frightened that he was talking in knots. Last night, it was because of the medicine. And he was forced to roll with Biming Qianyu, but tonight, he said that he would not roll with Biming Qianyu. Won't it be better in a few days? Ziqing's health is so good. What is a little wind chill? There was a hint of anger in Biming Qianyu's tone, but his hand had already penetrated into Junhua's body through the collar and stroked it wantonly. For the first time, Junhua deeply understood what it meant to lift a stone and hit his own feet, and felt that the big hand was about to touch a point on his chest. He grabbed the big hand and stepped back. "Prince, I am really unwell. If Prince really wants to, will it be okay to wait until my body is better? By the time I'm well, maybe I'll have left the Wanyu palace." Junhua thought shamelessly. Biming Qianyu originally didn't plan to let Junhua go, but when he touched Junhua's body, he realized that the other party's body was hot and still feverish. And he really let him go as soon as his heart softened. He didn't know why he was soft-hearted. If he was someone else, he wouldn't care if the other party was uncomfortable or not. And he would punish him first. "All right, but you must stay with this prince tonight." He had already given in once, and could never concede a second time. Junhua was a little surprised when he saw Biming Qianyu give in, but he didn't dare to continue to die at this moment. Otherwise he was really afraid that he would annoy Biming Qianyu and cause some trouble for himself. "Don't you stay, it's okay, as long as you don't serve Biming Qianyu, it's easy to say anything." He turned around and wanted to sit back on the bed, but his legs were weak, his body was crooked, and he almost fell on the bed, but fortunately, Biming Qianyu reacted in time and hugged his waist to save him from the embarrassing situation of falling. If you're not feeling well, don't toss around. Biming Qianyu was a little angry, but he held back his anger and helped Junhua to lie down. Junhua looked at the man who was obviously angry but moved very close and gentle, as if something inadvertently broke into his heart. He quickly closed his eyes, didn't look at it, didn't think about it, and slept honestly. But his calm heart had been disturbed by the person in front of him, and he couldn't calm down. And this bad feeling made him very irritable. In particular, Biming Qianyu took off his coat and lay beside him, which made him alarm and wanted to escape from this place. Biming Qianyu's arm passed through the back of his neck, making him stiff, and his body was just about to take a step back. Biming Qianyu's other hand was already on his waist. And then with a force, he was held tightly in his arms by Biming Qianyu. Feeling the tight and powerful chest and the strong and powerful heartbeat of Biming Qianyu, his thoughts were in turmoil. And the picture of last night always appeared in his mind. Wheat-colored skin, firm and broad chest, strong heartbeat, and obvious muscle lines in the abdomen all show the strong charm of a man. Especially, he shook his head, hypnotizing himself that he couldn't think about it, or he was afraid that he would accidentally fall into it. Biming Qianyu, who was holding him, looked relaxed, and the tip of his nose was filled with Junhua's faint but good-smelling body fragrance. The body fragrance on Junhua's body is not like the sweet fragrance on a woman's body, but a faint grass fragrance, which is sweet and fresh. And it soothes the irritability in his heart in an instant. Biming Qianyu waited for Junhua to fall asleep before he got up and walked out of the room.